with the way that AI has evolved, especially in recent years with the agentic coding, it's not just the engineers who are going to be putting together these prototypes. There's definitely some challenges, of course, right? So the first one is we want to empower them to not only kind of work in these isolated environments, but we want it to be real for them because it's going to be real for the users. A lot of times it's really surprised them that it can do that, that the agent is actually able to not just write the code, but they can run it themselves and they can see that something is not going quite as expected and they can fix it.
Hi, I'm Scott, one of the founders of Olio apps. We build custom software and help other companies build and ship software solutions. On today's podcast, we're going to talk about using AI during the design phase to explore multiple directions and make better products. So in the past, when building a software project, coding was generally the most time-consuming part of the process. So you had to spend a lot of time up front to get the design right because you might not have the time or budget to do it again. But today, with AI coding tools, prototyping is cheap. So you can afford to try multiple directions, get a feel for how each one works, and choose the best one. Sort of flipping the design and development process around. Ideation, build a few ideas, loop that into a more refined design. My guest today is Mukhtar Bahadouri. He's one of the lead engineers at Olio apps, and I'll hand it over to him to share his process.
So we'll kind of talk about one area that, from my experience throughout all these years, it's always had like a lot of churn in terms of just a lot of discussions on how it could be and what it should do, and just a lot of back and forth. When really it's very simple in its core, and that's a drag and drop, right? So you have an item, and you can take it and you can reposition it within a list. Sometimes you can take it and move it between other lists, things like that, but not in here. But one really important thing is that, right, as we're building these, there is kind of this hidden layer, which is really the data, and we really want to optimize for the user experience, but the data can have some nuanced interactions to it, right? So for instance, in here, for these two examples that I have, and the first one, it is the one where it syncs in live as I'm moving it around, things shift, and when I drop it, it goes into the position that it's in. In the other experience, it's a little bit different. It uses the insert position, preview position. So you can see a little preview of where it will land. It's just a little ribbon. And you'll notice the really big difference is nothing is really shifting around in this UI. It's just very flat. So what really, we want to think about is, right, one is the user experience, which is really how this works. But then the other thing is the data that we might have. So as an engineer, usually we're a little bit more informed about the data. And we kind of know that, for instance, for our use case, we know that it's not going to be just these amount of cards that we need to be kind of repositioning on this at the screen at once. We know that, for instance, we might have something more, we might have like hundreds in there. And of course, we'll have to worry about scrolling and things like that and performance, right? And so now that I've added more, when I'm moving this around, in here, there's just a little bit of lag, right? And now when I'm moving it around in here, there's still a little bit of lag, but it's not really noticeable because things aren't moving around. So in the new age with AI and all the ways that it's really empowering us to get a lot of productivity with these things, we can not only get this, in front of someone much faster to see what it looks like, what the user experience will be, and we can really put ourselves into what the user is doing and see if we like that. What we can also do is we can kind of worry about it within the data layer. So that means not really in this very isolated environment. We can even put this into whatever app that we're in, whatever lists of data that we might have. And again, you might be multiple lists that we might be concatenating between. So it's kind of really a big lifesaver in that way, that we get to see not only the user experience much quicker, but also what implications it has for our data. And so that's just one perspective as an engineer, but a lot of times, like, there's a lot of different perspectives that are involved into kind of getting this drag and drop experience put together and just making sure the users have the best experience imaginable. And with the way that AI has evolved, especially in recent years with the agentic coding, it's not just the engineers who are going to be putting together these prototypes. I actually had an incident recently where it was a designer who had put together a drag and drop prototype for something similar to this, but much much smaller in scale. We didn't have to worry about there being thousands of elements that needed to be moved around between the lists and things like that. But there were little micro interactions within the experience that we had to really get right. There was some animations and things that would just kind of move on the screen, which were very hard to express in Figma, right? Or whatever design tool you might be using. But with the power of agentic coding, our designer was able to put together an isolated prototype like this, and he was able to, fine tune the animations to exactly what he needed, and he was able to hand that off to us, and we were able to put it together much faster. So that's one example of how prototyping can really help us. But there's other things that we also do with prototyping in ways which we empower the designers and make their lives easier, right? So there might be instances where we need to actually empower them to be inside the application, right? So they need to build it not in an isolated environment like this. They need to actually spin up the application and build it in there and make sure that it works great, right?
Yeah, I imagine there's some challenges with that.
There's definitely some challenges, of course, right? So the first one is we want to empower them to not only kind of work in these isolated environments, but we want it to be real for them because it's going to be real for the users. And with the way that the agent decoding and developments recently in that area, it's really possible to do that. So next up, I'm going to kind of show the prompt that I used to kick this one off, and you can reuse this, and I'll be able to kind of build it all together pretty seamlessly. So just a TypeScript React application. There's two different drag and drop experiences, what it does for each one. And here's something really interesting. So I had the agent use Playwright CLI to ensure that the UI loads and behaves as expected. So it's going to be able to use this tool to actually spin up a Chrome instance, and it can actually start dragging things around and make sure that things work as expected, and create a Vercel production and also a test suite. So we'll look at this in the end. And I kind of want to talk about this because this is really an area that has been very pivotal for us as engineers. Because not only can we build, we can get things, in front of someone much quicker. We can also do it, I think, in a more safer manner. So all this context that we use to build this thing and have the robot kind of validate its own work and get into a loop, for example, we can use that same context to build a test suite that can be even end-to-end, and that's very valuable. But as far as kind of getting someone else involved, it can be as simple as something like this. So from my experience and getting my designers onboarded and working within the context of the application, of course, there's the environment, things like that, but it's really simple. Like, we just install the dependencies, build the project, and sometimes they might have some things that they might need in their environment. They might not have Playwright CLI, right? So I always include something like this for whatever type of person I might be syncing up with to help them get started. I always try to include a tool that can help them automate at least getting it up and running. And it's been a lot of times it's really surprised them that it can do that the agent is actually able to not just write the code, but they can run it themselves and they can see that something is not going quite as expected, and they can fix it. So for instance, in here, there are some directives that there's some expectations that the project should do. And using this tool here, the agent is able to use that to make sure that it actually works as expected. So that's like one way that we help them get started. But the other really important part is the data. Data is kind of like the core of software development. Without data, we don't really have anything. we wouldn't have we wouldn't have items in this list to drag around, or we wouldn't even be able to have this discussion or run into a scenario where we have to consider between these two, and we don't really know. But at the end of the day, it's a very simple thing. We just move it from one position to another. So it's the data. And again, the idea is to get the designers, these folks that are not very data centric, and a place where they can safely create these things in the context of the application where everything else is, and they can kind of see exactly what the user would see, not just isolated. And another thing I want to talk about is MCP tools. So we all kind of interact with data differently, and we have different expectations for data and different levels of understanding. And the amazing thing recently with MCP tools is that we're able to anyone can use the agent along with some MCP tool to kind of talk about it regarding the data in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that's closest to what they're doing, what the knowledge that they have. And some ways that we do some ways as engineers that we empower folks to get into that position is, for instance, we might allow them to have a wrapper over something like a Postgres CLI, or even a little MCP server that has specific queries that are run, and it's not as broad as such as a Postgres CLI, right? And they're able to use that and talk to it in English and really get the data and how it works, and why the user might be in a certain state, and why are the list of items that are being dragged around looking like how they are, even though we're kind of moving them between each other. But sometimes the content of them really changes that experience. So kind of as an example of using the CLI, and again, we have all the context here that we use to build this example, or really any type of prototype, or really any feature. We can reuse that exact same context to build a test suite. So let's look at something which is kind of involved. So we'll go ahead and open this up. So we can, this is this last part of actually, let me actually reload really quick. So this is going to do the last part of the application. So it's going to be this very last part. So let me restart on that. So as we're building really any feature, or we're doing any type of prototyping, we might have all this, sorry, let me start one more time. As we're really building any feature, or we're doing any type of prototyping, we might give the agent something like this to build out what we have in mind, such as this drag and drop experience. But what we can do at the end is we can actually take that context that the agent has, and we can use it to build a test suite. And it can be quite involved, and not just unit tests, but something that's very much alive. So we'll kind of look at this this bit right here now, which is a Playwright test suite. It takes the two examples, takes an item, moves it to a different position, and then does it for the next one, and does this a couple times. So let me go ahead and open that up. So in here, we're just watching it. So it took the first item and moved it right above the fourth one. Now it did it again for the next example. Now it's just kind of doing it in a loop. So it's very interesting, right? Normally, like a test suite like this, especially one that's not just something in React testing library. This is a Playwright test suite. So this is actually in a browser. And I have a little bit of experience building these test suites in React React testing library. The one big nuance is that a lot of times when you're doing it just with Jest and React testing library, you can't, there is no dimension to these elements. You can kind of test out your logic that things work, but the fact that things actually collide with each other and they move around and really all that stuff, and you can take this and take screenshots of it. You can't do that in Jest and React testing library, but using something like Playwright, which is pretty full-fledged, normally this would have a lot of cost to it as well. You can really put this together very quickly, just reusing the same context that you built out the feature.
Yeah, these are difficult to get right, and LLM can actually visually evaluate what's going on or take screenshots. I'm not sure if it's doing that, but yeah, was there any other engineering challenges that you ran into with getting the prototypes going, or including the designers in the process?
Yeah, I think one really important one is how do we kind of move really fast and write some code that is not just this, in this isolated example, it's live in the application, but we can actually get it deployed and we can get, some more eyes on it, some more hands that where we actually, interact with it and see what it does. And you really have to be really careful around here, right? So it definitely adds a little bit more steps that you have to go through. For instance, some things that we've done is we have an environment where it's just a preview environment, and we're very quickly able to put these up, and it doesn't have any production user data, and it's just kind of I suppose it's the exact same application, but it's just in a seeded preview environment where really anyone can, at any level or scale of prototyping that they may have to do, they can very quickly get it up and they can get it deployed and they can share it. And I think that's really important.
Cool. Well, it sounds like major unlock is not just that you can prototype rapidly with AI assisted tools, but that you can include others who historically couldn't be involved directly in the coding process, and they can iterate on these prototypes as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, for us, like the most important part is the data, right?
What do you mean by, can you elaborate a little bit more on what's on like the importance of data, and like, what happens if you don't get the data right?
Another thing that we kind of do to make sure that we're kind of prototyping safely and that we're as productive as we can be. So we try to really be mindful about kind of the changes that we're introducing in the environment. So sometimes we might have some really great ideas that might need to be prototyped, but I think it's still important to keep the engineers in the loop and to kind of what you may have in mind so we can help consult you that, hey, this might have some implications for maybe the data layer or X, Y, and Z. So for getting the data right, I do think it does, it's something that we have to be collaborative about. And really the important part about all this agentic tooling that we have, it allows the engineers to not be so horizontally isolated. We can get more involved and we can kind of get in there, right? And we can be with you and make sure that what you're building, it can actually, we can actually deliver it and we can make it live in a way that makes the most sense. And it can also help us be, mindful of the implications it might have for timelines, things like that.
All right, thank you, Mukhtar.
Thank you, Skip.